going to turn now to the Ecclesia Dei communities. We'd already mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago, the FSSP for Peace and Fraternity of St. Peter is got the Vatican showing up to be investigating them. And there was a story about a week ago. We had too much really last week to cover this, so it's a little older, but it's worth talking about. So you're going to tell us about this sort of latest development.
Yeah, this is something, it's been covered before, but we wanted to wait for a little bit more information to come out. We'll explain about that in a second. But also, I've noticed some commentators aren't getting the full picture here. I wanted to first go to the actual statement itself, which was published for October. This is on the Confraternity's French website, the Fraternity of St. Peter's French website, and the priest here says, and speaking as the FSSP, at least for this would be almost like the French SSPX district speaking, but he goes on to say, firstly, we suffer greatly from not being understood by some bishops or priests who believe that our liturgy divides the church. Pause right quick there. That's problematic language to start out with. If you're saying we're not being understood, we're not dividing the church. Actually, we are dividing the church. What the Novus Ordo is something that's been imposed that is harming the church. The traditional mass is going to divide the church because practically, out of what we're seeing with Rome, we're seeing two religions at the end of the day. So it is divisive. So I don't like that language. But he goes on to say, we're suffering from all this. But he says, however, we too must do a little examination of conscience and ask ourselves the question of the image we sometimes give those around us. If the great majority of the faithful and the so-called traditional priests aspire only to the sanctification of their souls according to the ancient liturgical and disciplinary means of the church, others, sometimes involuntarily in smaller numbers but noisy, seem to be engaged in a kind of struggle against the conciliar church, pointing out scandals, sometimes unfortunately very real, cultivating opposition and making public judgments without nuance and without any authority for it, which is, again, very odd. What is somebody supposed to do when you see grave scandal coming out of Rome, or when Rome says all religions are a path to God? Are we supposed to just say, well, we'll ignore that? That's the Pope speaking. It needs to be talked about, especially by news outlets or those covering the church. We're not a religion that seeks to hide the truth. If we're hiding the truth, we're an inherently deceptive religion, and that can't be the case. But he goes on to say, a movement that many in our circles know, Paix Liturgique, is particularly illustrated in the field of polemics, and is, I believe, doing us great harm, offering a caricature and deplorable image of our liturgical family that it nevertheless proposes to defend. So I want to also take some time here, because I think what many might say is, why does the fraternity feel the need to call out a random Catholic outlet like this? It would be almost as if the SSPX called out the Catholic Family News or something like that. It's very odd and out of place. But if you've been listening to this show for about a year or so, you'll know that we covered something that explains this back in December. And to sort of give a flashback to that December news that we gave, there was a bishop in France who got very bothered by something Pax Liturgique said in one of their posts, which critiqued some of the liturgical practices in the diocese. And the bishop, right after trying to implement Traditionis Custodes, really expelled the FSSP from that diocese, or at least put them under a local diocesan priest and really restricted what they could do. And in recent months, Pax Liturgique has done an amazing job documenting what's been going on in that diocese, how it's slowly, in a diocese that has almost a million Catholics, it's slowly dwindling more and more, has barely any priests as it is, but now you've got more and more traditional priests who are being expelled. They've been talking about this, and now the FSSP, realizing that that's one of the reasons that they got expelled in the first place, is calling out the Pax Liturgique. And it's very strange, because rather than taking ownership of one's position, taking ownership that the traditional Latin Mass is divisive, is the way that we need to move forward, and that we need to call out abuse, Instead, we're blaming the victims. We're blaming Pax Liturgique for doing great journalistic work. And one of the reasons why we wanted to wait is to see what Pax Liturgique was going to say, because I thought this is very odd. You have the major fraternity calling them out, singling them out, and they produced a great article, I think, on their French website. If liturgical peace, Pax Liturgique, no longer existed, would everything be better in the conciliar church? And I think they make some very good observations here. And look, we don't agree with everything they've said in the past, but they are certainly moving in the right direction. They say this, quote, the FSSP, born from the refusal of the consecrations of Icône in 1988, is for the French diocese a cumbersome guest. The situation is radically different from that of the SSPX, which exercises traditional Catholic worship on its own premises. It is therefore not deportable. And they go on to say, they go on to say that the position of the traditional mass is non-negotiable, and they say if the FSSP remains silent in the face of the council, the more it will disorganize its own networks by depriving them of an overall understanding. Under the present pontificate, the confusion of minds is incredibly increasing in its confusing nature. So I think they've done a wonderful job in responding to the FSSP. I really think this is a shameful thing for the FSSP to do. In this time when they're being visited, and obviously facing injustice, rather than boldly facing that injustice, they've taken to calling out fellow traditionalists. And look, there is something to be said that we definitely need to be prudent in how we're acting. We need to be charitable in how we're acting, but that does not mean ignoring the situation at hand and ignoring the facts in front of us. And unfortunately, I think that's what the FSSP has been tending to do, especially recently. So look, we want the best for these communities. We don't want to see any communities suppressed or the FSSP go away. But I would like the FSSP to take their position seriously and actually stand for the traditional mass, and not take what I think is really an insincere take of holding back your critiques of the Second Vatican Council, holding back your critiques of the Novus Ordo, and then pretending this is just our charism. That's why we want to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. We celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. We hold the traditional Catholic faith because it saves your soul, not because it's a charism or some kind of ordinariate situation. So that's my take. Do you think I'm being too hard on the fraternity here, Brian?
No, I don't think so. I mean, because it's sort of almost the syndrome of people who have been persecuted for a long time, right? Instead of blaming the persecutor, they turn and blame, fellow prisoners who are in this, who are also being persecuted. And the FSSP is really the greatest example, but even some of the other communities essentially tried to make the same bargain that the church made at Vatican II with liberalism, right? Look, we'll call a truce. And we've talked about this before with liberalism. We'll call a truce. We'll stop condemning you, and you'll leave us alone, and the church will have more freedom. And it was a Faustian bargain. It's always a lie. You can't compromise with liberalism, and you end up being persecuted still, even though you compromise. And I think that's really what's happened. Their approach, it's funny. I've known people who've said this about priests. I've had conversations with FSSP priests who say the Novus Ordo is bad. It needs to go away. The traditional mass is better. It's a matter of principle. But I can only say that to you in the living room here over a drink. We can't say that publicly. Essentially, they're saying our deal is we can have these views as long as we keep them to ourselves. And publicly, we're all part of one big happy liturgical family. And that's the deal we've struck. We'll be left alone. We'll be allowed to live our life and do our things. And again, there's a certain understanding. Like you said, they're bringing mass and sacraments to people. And they sort of, I think, well, if we don't make this compromise, these people will be left without a mass and sacraments. So we just have to make this deal with Rome. And it's okay. It doesn't have any consequences. It gives us freedom. But, as we're seeing with the visitation, I mean, that it may be like liberalism, that you make the deal, you keep your mouth shut, you don't compromise publicly, you hold your views close to the vest, and you get persecuted anyway. I mean, in France, it's been harsh. I mean, it's already happened. They've been thrown out of at least 2 dioceses. You mentioned one story. There was another one. And it's It is really, I think, ultimately, even if there's short-term success, a long-term losing strategy. Now, does that mean you have to stand up every day denouncing Vatican II? And no. And it's funny, when we first started going to the Society of St. Pius X, people said, every week, all you're going to hear is scandals, denunciations, attack. And actually, you don't. I mean, most Sundays, it's good, just wholesome doctrine and mystical meditation or spiritual guidance. But as things occur from time to time, right? There's a sermon or there's a article published or something on this is why the new mass is wrong. Bishop Fillet gave a long, conference several years ago on why the new mass is bad, why people don't go to it. So it's not an obsession with these things, but it is, if you just wall them off, put them behind ropes and say, we're not going to go there in exchange for toleration, I think it's a losing strategy.
Yeah, and we've talked about this on a few other shows before. How really every position, because this is a crisis in the church,
Yeah.
has very major difficulties with it. I mean, the SSPX has to deal with the recognize and resist position, has to deal with saying, well, look, we've had all these errors go on for so long. How can that be? The set of a contest position has to deal with the visibility of the church and where ordinary jurisdiction is. But I think what has to underlie every position and what we should go into the crisis thinking is making sure that we assert that we're going to be authentic with how we
Mm.
have our position, that if we really do believe something, that we're going to act like it. I think that's kind of the core of our religion itself. We should act in accord with how we believe. And I have major problems with, as you mentioned, saying things behind closed doors, but not willing to say them publicly, or publicly making it seem like, I mean, just apparently, I mean, from that, not being understood by the bishops and priests, things like this. I have a major difficulty with that. And I think that makes it an inherently
Mm.
weak position when we're saying this. However, the most important thing at the end of the day is we're keeping the traditional faith. We're going to the traditional mass, because that's
Yeah.
what's going to get us out of this world alive, right? That's what's going to
Yes.
get us the sanctifying grace that we need and progress in the spiritual life. So we need to pray for all of the former Ecclesia Dei communities. We want to see them promote the traditional faith, the traditional mass, but I'd like to see it more authentic.
I definitely agree with you there.